Hello and welcome to our Chalk Talk. We're happy it's Friday and we're happy you're here. I want to introduce Brian Beinstorp. He is an Adult Protective Services investigator with the Kenosha County Department of Aging, Disability, and Behavioral Health Services. Adult Protective Services, or APS, is tasked with investigating reports and allegations surrounding abuse, neglect, self-neglect, and financial exploitation of individuals at risk, and to assist with connecting the community to various services and resources. He's also a member of the Advanced Directive Work Team, which is a subgroup of the Kenosha Care Transitions Coalition, and has a strong background in adult crisis, and managed care, as well as dementia care and services. He's provided countless trainings in the Kenosha area on these topics and more. In addition, he's the liaison between the Kenosha County Protective Services and the Kenosha County Adult Crisis Unit, and the trainer for Kenosha County Adult Crisis Unit related to Chapter 55, part of the Mental Health Emergency Response Team for the Kenosha County Job Center, and a Community Dementia Safety Campaign Committee member. So Brian, you can take it away.
Thank you so much, Rachel. It's nice to be working with you again. And I'd like to thank Marty and Advocate Aurora for the chance to speak on this topic. Adult Protective Services is sometimes an understood realm of our community, and so we do relish in that opportunity. I'd like to begin by thanking everyone for joining us today and making it very clear that Adult Protective Services, or APS, functions differently in every state, and its parameters are set by state statutes. And as I function within Wisconsin, I am mainly familiar with Wisconsin's laws. So since there's folks here on the meet today from several states, I will try to keep things as general as possible, but I hope throughout the meeting's discussion that can be at least kept in mind. So understanding that palliative care can be provided in many different settings, including that of an independent environment, I'd like to start by giving a very quick overview of how Adult Protective Services functions, and then open it up to the group for questions and discussion as to how you all feel it relates to your specific situation. So what does APS do? Each county in Wisconsin is required to have protective services to our folks. By law, it's typical of most states. There are subtle variations, of course, from state to state, but we do investigate those concerns of self-neglect, neglect by others, financial exploitation, abuse, which is physical, sexual, and mental. And I think for the most part, in terms of palliative care, the focus would likely be that neglect, self-neglect, and abuse type situations. Not to say financial exploitation isn't definitely something that palliative care could see red flags about, and it's definitely a growing concern in our country at a very systemic level. So Adult Protective Services by law in Wisconsin does deal with adults at risk and elders at risk, so that's people 18 and over. A very brief description would be, everyone's probably familiar with CPS, or Child Protective Services. We are kind of the same thing, but for 18 and over. What do people 18 and over need protective services for? Well, adults at risk, those 18 to 59-year-olds, are typically individuals that are considered vulnerable because of a physical disability, developmental disability, mental health issue, things of those nature. So those folks are considered vulnerable and needing protection. And then the elder at risk in Wisconsin, being 60 or over, does make you a vulnerable adult by statute alone. So that's kind of what I was talking about in terms of the physical or developmental disabilities that an adult at risk may have. And once again, those elder at risk may have those physical, developmental, other medical condition disorders, but they do then qualify as well. So those are the 4 risk categories. There's abuse, so that's intentional, physical, sexual, or emotional abuse. Neglect, so that's failure of a caregiver to provide for that person based on what their needs are. And caregiver is defined as somebody that's voluntarily or formally a caregiver for an individual. So that could be through an agency, or it could be a family member, friend, neighbor, those kinds of things. Self-neglect is really just what it sounds like. It's the failure by typically a competent individual to provide for their own care. And that's where we get those blurred lines of folks maybe in the community making a report that my neighbor is living in squalor or making bad choices. And we'll get into how you think someone should live and how they actually have to live are two different things. And then financial exploitation. So that's just as it sounds, misuse of the person's resources. So there are some signs to look for each of these risk categories. So physical abuse, you're going to see those bruises, sprains, fractures, marks, maybe wincing when somebody comes near you as a caregiver. That's often the way that caregivers can see that maybe there is abuse by someone else in their life. There's the sexual abuse signs, so tears, bruises, blood, those types of things. If a person has difficulty going to the bathroom, and then the emotional kind is the language or behavior that's really just forceful type stuff, intimidating, humiliating, harassing. Even just saying, I'm going to stop being your caregiver if you don't do A, B, or C, or you do A, B, and C. So those types of things are absolutely not okay as well. Neglect is the caregiver who's taken on the responsibility for the individual's care, once again, voluntary or formally. Those signs would be improper, inadequate care, like lack of medical care, keeping people from seeing loved ones or other caregivers, isolating them, keeping them from their mental health care, lack of food, shelter, clothing, those types of things, or just straight out not caring for them, not meeting with them if this is somebody who's housebound, and they're not coming to meet their needs on a regular basis per their needs. That would be considered that too. So self-neglect is really a big one for us, and often some of our most complex cases. So that does deal with a competent person who fails to provide for their own care. You'll see squandering of assets or resources. Sometimes we'll be defining them as a spendthrift. Competence is very difficult to ascertain. It's something that we do often in the field. We are not medical professionals, so we have to really use our training and our best judgment. And in Wisconsin, we do by law have the ability to make that in the field call. And if we feel that a person is not competent or likely to be not competent and they're in an imminent situation of danger, we can take involuntary measures. That's always a last resort, but we do have that ability in Wisconsin as well. So competency is really not something that one can make as, boy, they're making a decision different than what I would make, so they can't be competent, or they're not going to a doctor when they clearly should, so they're not competent. Competency is determined by a judge in our state. So decision-making ability is really the process of making that decision, not the decision itself. So do they understand the risks involved with their decisions? Are they okay with those risks? You can have an elderly lady living in her own home, and she may have a history of falls, and she is depressed and not wanting really to be here anymore, and she feels she's lived long enough, which is a very common scenario that we deal with. And they, for example, could barricade the door because they don't want medical assistance if they should fall. That sounds like somebody who would be not competent by some folks, but in all honesty, if they're doing it knowing that the risk is that they won't get the help and that's really their goal, that almost is a sign of competency, that they understand the risk with their decision. It may not be a good decision, but it's theirs to make. We cannot come into somebody's home and tell them that they have to stop hoarding or they have to bathe more frequently or things like that, just because we feel that they should be doing those things. People have a right, as long as they're able to make their own decisions, to make their own decisions, just like you or I. And we're not going to come into your house and tell you what to do. So we're not going to do that to them either. So that financial exploitation too is a big one, and it's growing exponentially in our country. Millions and millions and millions of dollars a year are lost through exploitation scams. There's so many different ones, and it's a very difficult one to really address, in the sense that the folks often that are experiencing this exploitation, it's done often by family members, and they don't want them to be prosecuted. They don't want to feel like they have failed as a parent if it's their child, things like that. Or if it's a caregiver that is a child or family member too, they're afraid that now their caregiver won't care for them anymore, and then what are they going to do? And so our job would then become, here's what your options are. We can make sure that your care needs are always met and it's insured, and this doesn't need to continue. So we have difficult times regaining lost assets on folks, but what we can always do is create a situation where we can stop it from continuing. And then if we are going to try to get like the PD's office involved, for example, and trying to prosecute the individual to try to regain those lost assets, that's something we can do as well. So I'm not going to delve into this too much, but this is just for Kenosha County where I work. And the main part of this table that I want to make clear is going back from 2012 to current. If you look at the adult referrals, so that's 18 to 59, that number hasn't really changed a whole lot. Looking at the elder referrals, that's the one that's growing a lot. So our total is high. We are on pace for almost 700 referrals this year, which is way more than we're used to doing. The nature of the cases are getting more complex. The number of cases are getting more complex. And so the elder referrals, because that population alone is growing, and I'm sure those of you that work in the fields that you work in see that as well, that aged population is getting much, much larger. And unfortunately, the pool of individuals to assist them is not growing at the same rate. So here's something to touch on that. The boomers, January 16 is really when the first official boomers began turning 70, and they're going to come through our system as well as all systems between now and 35. We deal a lot with folks with degenerative brain disorders. That's the Alzheimer's, the dementias, things like that. So many of them will present with that. And there's almost 6 million people in the United States with a diagnosis of Alzheimer's and dementia. And there's a new diagnosis nearly every minute in our country. And as you get, I believe the Alzheimer's Association current statistics are 1 in 6 over 60 has a diagnosis, 1 in 4 over 70, 1 in 3 over 80, and 1 in 2 over 90. So it's a very startling statistic. So from an APS perspective, who are we mostly dealing with? By and large, statistically, they are females, they're isolated, they're dependent on other people, they're aged between 70 and 90, and financial status doesn't appear to be a factor. So socioeconomic factors are not going to keep an individual immune from needing protective services or being exploited or abused. And most often those abusers are the family members. It's 60% of the time they're related. They're often caregivers. They're often friends, neighbors, or in a position of trust. Those are the folks that they're most vulnerable to. And they typically do have a criminal background, but not always. And especially with financial exploitation, those scams and telemarketing things are a huge factor. So why don't they report? Going back again to that shame and guilt. Boy, have I failed somewhere. Boy, I can't believe that I fell for this. I can't believe I let this go on as long as I have. So there's that fear, that loss of independence. That's a huge one. Humiliation as well. If they have a cognitive or physical disability, they're kind of in a position where they don't have a whole lot of the tools that maybe you and I would have to address these things. And that lack of knowledge or unaware is my job today, doing these types of outreaches, this education, that there are services for folks out there in every state to help them through this process. Nobody has to do these things alone. There's tons of consequences to these types of things, and palliative care, I'm sure, sees a lot of these consequences in terms of the isolation, the increase in the health concerns, therefore the need for increased care through services and support systems, an unnecessary rapid deterioration, even death, inability to qualify for programs, especially through financial abuse situations. If an individual is exploited financially, they're not going to be eligible necessarily for state aid or public programs down the road because of that potential divestment that has occurred. And now what? And so we have to try to bridge that gap, and that's a huge concern as well. So who can make these referrals? Anybody can. In Wisconsin, our law is that we can't divulge our referral sources. So if anyone calls us and we go out, excuse me, and make a visit, oftentimes the first question is, who called you? By law, we can't divulge that, and it's important for our referral sources to know because they don't have to fear retaliation. If the individual can determine it through deduction, we have no control over that, but we will make every effort to ensure that it's not divulged through us and that it's truly coming from a place of care and compassion. If folks could call us and we would tell them who called, nobody would call us. So we have a lot of tactics that we use in the community to ensure that when we're addressing a concern that the individual we're working with understands those things. A big part of our job is to establish those relationships. If we can't get where we want to be the first call, that doesn't mean we won't get another call in a month, 2 months, 6 months, or a year. And we want them to have had a good feeling about us and be willing to work with us. And if we don't get where we want on the first call, we ensure they have the ability to reach out at any time should something change. Our job is not to force people to do things. We are the good guys. If we encounter someone who thinks that we're not the good guy, it's probably because you're not a good guy. So we often encounter those situations. We do make enemies in this job, but we make a lot more friends. And so typically if there's a bad story about us, it's probably because you were a wrongdoer yourself. So the country at large has an elder care locator. I have the number there. If you don't know how to access your local protective services, that is a national phone number. You can do it. There is an online way to do it as well. Just search elder care locator. That's a public service of the U.S. Administration on Aging. But in Wisconsin, every county has to have access. We have aging and disability resource centers that every county in Wisconsin has access to. By and large, a majority of our 72 counties do all of their adult protective services referrals through their aging and disability resource center. That is no different here in my county. But if all else fails, simply putting in your county name and searching adult protective services will likely get you where you want to be. So what do you do if you're in a home and you suspect something? In Wisconsin, there is no recourse, or should I say, ability for retaliation or liability on behalf of a person making a referral in good faith. Whether you're wrong or not, it doesn't matter. Adult Protective Services guiding principle is do no harm. We are not going to go in and make a situation worse than it is when we become involved. A really good example of that would be like a hoarding situation. You could walk into somebody's home. Clearly, it's an issue, an environmental concern. Are we going to be calling code enforcement and housing and all of these things? Probably not. What is that really going to help with? They're going to start getting fined potentially. They're going to not like us anymore, and they definitely won't work with us next time. And so we really use that soft approach and putting our arm around them. And what can we do to walk down this path together and get to a better solution? And even if they aren't agreeable in that moment, I think when they put their head down at night and they see that, and we reach out again in the future or we get another call, our hope is that they'll be more willing to work with us. And that's how we make progress in our community, in our opinion. Always trust your instincts and always report it. There's no blame, no fault in creating a report. Once again, it's not going to come back to you, at least through us. And so everything is confidential. Our records are always confidential. Everything that ever is released has to be done through a subpoena through the courts. So there's no worry about that. So we do have to initiate our cases within 24 hours of receiving the referral. It is not an emergency response system. That is law enforcement. We do have 24-hour adult crisis workers that do my job after hours. So I'm lucky. I get to be an 8 to 5 Monday through Friday kind of guy. But crises don't always happen Monday through Friday, 8 to 5, do they? So we do have other individuals that do our job as well outside of that. And every competent person has the right to live with risk and refuse intervention. So sometimes we get a bad rap. Adult Protective Services came out, they didn't do anything. We can't always do something. We can't force ourselves into a situation and tell somebody what to do. We have the law to work within. We are not going to break the law for anybody, but we will always be there to support and advocate for somebody when they're ready for that. And that support and advocacy isn't always for the individual at risk. Sometimes it's for the reporter too. So we do have those types of abilities. So our initial contact is typically unannounced. That's for obvious reasons. And they typically want to know who called us. Once again, we cannot divulge that, but we always prefer that the referral sources give us their information so that we can come back to them with any questions, but we don't always have to follow up with them about the outcome of cases. We do that though from time to time if needed. So people do have those rights. It's not against the law to not shower, keep a filthy house, not take your meds, not see your doctor. But if decision-making is a concern, we can talk about guardianships. We can talk about activating POAs, creating POAs. We do a lot of that. But if we find that competency is a concern and decision-making isn't happening the way that it should be, and they are found to be an imminent risk of harm, then we're talking about some kind of involuntary type of action. So that would be like a chapter where we would detain them and provide them services. So those are the incapacities we've kind of talked about. Incapacity and competency are two different things. Those of you in the medical field understand that competence or capacity is something that's determined from a medical provider, and competency is something that is done through the courts. We do a lot of advanced directives. That kind of keeps the need from guardianship from being needed, and it gives the individual the right to make the decision of who their decision maker will be if it's needed. Guardianships don't always offer that. The judges make those calls. So those of you who don't have power of attorney, I recommend that highly. Rachel knows that that's kind of my soapbox, and I won't go any further into that for the sake of time, but get your advanced directives. It's a way to get control for sure. We work very closely with all kinds of entities in the community. We have established longstanding relationships with many, many entities, and really that's to better serve the community. So discussion time. If you guys have any questions about anything, I know I flew through that. Typically that presentation is like 45 minutes. So I apologize. But if there's any clarification you guys want, anything you want to share about your own situation, success stories, any barriers that you've experienced, general questions or comments, we'd love to hear them.
Hi, my name is Patrice. I have a question for you. So I understand the statement you made about competent adults have the ability to take on risk or make poor decisions, but what capacity is there when you do a visit to assess if they truly are able to make that decision? I mean, sometimes I've called adult protective services and it's because I question their ability to make decisions, but I know that you're not psychologists or judges to make those decisions. So I'm just wondering what that process is.
So every investigator has their own process for that and what their comfort level is with those types of things. But that is something that we are often tasked with. And so we can use a series of different tactics depending on what the situation is. We have to really kind of fly by the seat of our pants in terms of what we think the best way to make those calls are. Sometimes there's very obvious, egregious indicators of somebody having a concern for competency, and whether that be through the process in which they're making their decisions, maybe acts of omission that you're able to identify, or just simply asking them orientation questions. Who's the president? What year is it? How long have you lived here? And understanding the question of how old are you and when were you born are two very different questions. The answer to when were you born has been the same your whole life. How old are you changes. So understanding just those very subtle nuances, and it does seem that potentially some of those things can be trivial in terms of really getting to the nitty-gritty of somebody's competency, but we're not there to do a 4-hour assessment and really get into the meat and potatoes of their competency. Typically, we're there because we're in a crisis situation or a situation where there's really some needs to identify how to get met. And so if we have an idea that based on certain situations that we've experienced with them or acts that they're doing or answers to our questions, we can go down that path. And we will use tools like the mini mental status exam, the MOCA, animal naming. Those are kind of real formal things. Then once again, those informal, just having a conversation with somebody is really the best way, in my opinion. I've been doing this for many years. And those are great tools, don't get me wrong, to get uniform type outcomes. But I think what I've learned is the best way, and what really gets through to other folks on getting them on the same page is really just the conversation you've had. What have they talked about? What are the family members or caregivers seeing? Those types of things.
Okay, this is Jake. I was curious if you could say a little bit about the cultural understanding and training that goes into all the different APS workers, and what kind of cultural training you get, and also what you do when there's language barriers, and what kind of workarounds do you have with those?
Right, great questions, especially, that's always been an important thing, but it seems as though it's on the forefront of the landscape now more than ever, and that's a good thing. And I can once again only speak for my jurisdiction, but we do regular cultural competency trainings that are offered through our county and the state as well. And we often do our best to, and this is really the best we can do, is try to encompass as much of a breadth of knowledge in our staff and unit as possible. And understand that you're right, there are sensitivities that need to be made. Kenosha County, as some of you may know, has last year encountered a very racially dynamic type situation with the Jacob Blake shooting and the riots that ensued, and that has become a very hot topic here. And so how do we address that? The difficult thing is when you encounter a family member that isn't allowing you to maybe come and see the person you're there to see, and there being a perhaps racial divide between the worker and the family. And by law, we have to see the person, and the only person that can keep us from seeing them is the person themselves or their proxy decision maker. And so if we encounter a situation where there's a racial divide and the only tool we have to get to see the person is by involving law enforcement, is that really helping anything? So you're going to keep me from seeing your family member, so I'm going to call the cops on you and they're going to make me see them. So how do you address that? And there's no blanket answer for those things. It's really just situational. Our trainings are of, hey, this is the general population makeup of where we're working. This is what the odds are that you're going to encounter certain populations and cultures. What have we found in the past that's worked? What do we know that doesn't work? And it's really just an ever-changing piece of the work we do. And we're constantly growing and having to learn about those things. When we do experience, for example, a language barrier, we do have services that we use here in town, and they do not just include formal interpretation services. We actually have relationships with different organizations in our community that have individuals from different regions of the world that we've created contracts with, so that we can go out with them and they can come and be kind of that liaison between our agency and their culture, and help us understand what we're working with, and help them, on the family, for example, understand what our role is and what we're trying to do, and what are the best ways to kind of alleviate those barriers as much as possible. So once again, great question, very difficult answer, because there is no one way or even 5 ways that those things are done. It's all very situational and fluid. And we recognize clearly that this is something that needs to be done to be effective in the community. And so any suggestions ever are welcomed, but we're always working on that.
Brian, if we're encountering a case at our inpatient hospice facility or within the hospital itself, do you come within our facilities, or is it just at home?
No, I mean, we can. So once again, I can only speak for Wisconsin on a topic for the fact of licensures through those facilities and things like that. For the most part, the way that works is if a facility is licensed through the state, technically the state has jurisdiction over those things. Now, what I don't want that to sound like is if you're licensed, the APS isn't going to get involved. We know that the state doesn't always address things as quickly as needed, unfortunately. And so in the event that we get a report of maybe a sexual abuse situation or a physical abuse situation, or something that's creating an imminent threat or risk, and if nothing in the dynamic changes, it's likely to continue, we absolutely are going to address that. So we will come in. I work regularly in nursing homes, adult family homes, community-based residential facilities, residential community apartments, things like that, including assisted living and what have you. So just because there's a licensure involved does not mean we're not going to get involved. We understand that there is sometimes a need for something to be addressed sooner rather than later, and the state never minds that we do their job before they do. So with that being said, nothing's truly off the table.
I have a question. So Brian, how long do you follow, for example, a particular case? Do you stay with them for a year and then just do periodic phone calls? Or what is sort of that process for supporting that patient? And especially if they're not interested in support and they later call you maybe a few months down the road and say, we've changed our mind. So what, just sort of explain that process to me.
Right. So we are always here for everybody all the time, whether we have an open case formally or not. So there's no typical length of time. Every case is different. We could have a case that's, like a one and done. So it could be open for a day or two, especially if the person it's felt is competent and doesn't want our services, we have to leave. We're not going to force ourselves on somebody. Now that's an extreme, and another extreme would be, somebody that's maybe going through a temporary guardianship. Those are good for 60 days. We can renew them for an additional 60 days one time, so that's 120, obviously. And then if there's a need for permanent guardianship at that point, we would stay continuing on that case. So we could be on something for 6, 7, 8 months. Also, if there's just a situation in a case where the dynamic is ever changing and the need continues to be there for whatever reason, the way we decide if a case is to close is if the person's willing to work with us and we are able to identify what the risks and concerns are and then match them to what they want assistance with. Once we have formulated a long-term plan for their care and to have their needs met, and we have mainly resolved the risks that have been identified, there's no justification for us to keep a case open anymore. But what I often say is it's going to be a soft handoff always to whatever agency we're working with. And it's not going to be a referral and then we close it and hope that the referral goes through. We watch it, make sure that the handoff happens, that whoever gets the next piece is comfortable with it. And if anything arises, everybody always knows, the client, services, etc., that we may close the case. That just means it's formally closed, but we are always there to be involved. I would guess that probably 40% of my day is fielding things on cases that aren't open anymore. So a lot of my work is ensuring people know that we're a support for them. If they don't know who to call, they can call us. If we can't help them, we will always make sure they know where to go. I do a lot of removal of silos. So it's really getting organizations and entities to work together, and none of it is, this is your job, so do it. It's, can you help with this? And I'll hang tight while that happens to make sure that if something goes awry and if I can help with it, I will. So it's never over, but we are not considered long-term case management. We are identifying a crisis situation and risks. How do we bridge that gap and get out? And so it's never a rush to get out. We're never pressured by the state or the county to close a case. We have built enough trust with all of the entities that would want to do that, that if we have a case open, it's for good reason. And so very, very seldom are we closing a case before we're comfortable doing that. And we are not running from anything because it can always come back. And so let's get the best solution the first time and do what we can to ensure that they don't need us. And I often joke with my cases when they're closing is, I hope I never talk to you again, because that means I'm not needed. And they chuckle and they know where I'm coming from. And so it's really just that. It's, what can we do to make you not need us? And if I could work myself out of a job, that would be the best day of my life. But it'll never happen.
Nice, nice. Well, it's good to hear that you also are a person in the field who connects the dots for the patients or the vulnerable. So that's good. We need more people who connect dots. Any other final questions? Otherwise, I think we can wrap up this beautiful Friday morning and let everyone go on their way. Thank you so much, Brian. We appreciate this knowledge because I think many of us are aware of APS, but we didn't know in depth the amount of work and care that you provide for the community. And we're glad to know that anyone can call.
Absolutely. And
in
it
our
takes
facility,
a village, Rachel. So thank you to all of you as well out in the field, boots on the ground. We can't do it without you.
Good. Thanks for the collaboration, everyone. Have a beautiful day.